welcome everyone. This is the first of what we hope is a series of talks to try and replace some of the things that we're missing in these really challenging times. I want this to be a conversation, not a lecture. So, glass of wine is important. By all means, ask questions as we go. The story I'm about to tell you is a true story. For those who were in early, I have, to make it a bit more challenging for you and just to keep you awake, following the lines of the truth or lie programs, I might slip in one or two lies, and by all means shout out when you think you spot them. There aren't many. And you're all guinea pigs because this is the first one of these that we've done. It's a story of immense bravery, challenge, frustration, and ultimately success. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So here is a picture of the SS Egypt. It was a P&O liner. Its main role was journeying between London and either Australia or India. It was built in Glasgow in, I think it was 1897 on the Clyde. And in World War I, as you'll see later, it was a hospital ship. But before I go into the Egypt, we're going to jump to 1984. This is a photograph of the crew from the space shuttle repairing a satellite. On a previous launch, the satellite had failed and the satellite had been insured by Lloyd's. Lloyd's then commissioned part of the next shuttle trip to include repairing the satellite that was faulty. And this is a real picture of the work they're doing. Why is it relevant? Here we have a picture of Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. on a visit to London when he was president. They're visiting Lloyd's. This was just after the shuttle's success, which was obviously the highest ever salvage of its time. In Ronald Reagan's hand is a sovereign from the Egypt, which was donated to him as a symbol of the deepest salvage of its time from then it was 80 years before. It's an extraordinary story that just keeps on popping up again and again. Here is another picture of the Egypt during World War II as a hospital ship, painted white with crosses. The ship must have had the most extraordinary history. However, the Egypt left Tilbury on the 19th of May in 1922, carrying a crew and only 44 passengers. But also its cargo included gold and silver bullion and gold sovereigns worth over £1 million at that time, around £200 million today. The voyage proceeded normally until the early morning of the 20th, when they encountered fog. As a safety measure, the captain reduced speed. The Egypt remained in fog until the afternoon, when the navigator was able to sight landmarks on the French coast as they came out. After continuing the voyage, let me just flip to the next slide. They were off the coast of Brest. If you could see my mouse, they were off the coast of Brest, just about to enter the Bay of Biscay. They encountered another dense fog bank about 7 p.m. Captain stopped the engines, and very soon after they heard a fog whistle. The steamship Seine appeared out of nowhere and struck the Egypt's port side about 20 miles off the Amen lighthouse, Finisterre. Seine had a strengthened bow for icebreaking. The bow penetrated deeply into the Egypt's hull before the ships drifted apart and out of sight of each other. I'm going to quote from the book. The severe list hindered the launching of the lifeboats, so rafts and deck fittings were all cut loose so that they might float when the ship sunk. This action saved the lives of many. There were several instances of heroism, one case of an army officer who jumped into a boat and forced its occupants to return to the side of the sinking ship, eventually getting 70 people away. Meanwhile, the vessel which had done the damage returned, found the ship, and took all the survivors on board and conveyed them to Brest. A distress signal was transmitted and replies were received from 2 other steamers, but the Egypt sank within 20 minutes. Most of the passengers and crew were able to abandon ship, but 96 people on board lost their lives. Here is a headline from the Times, May the 22nd, 1922. Egypt lost off Ushant. Really a tragedy of its time. Now, the ship was insured through Lloyd's. Within 2 weeks, Lloyd's had paid out in full. Quite extraordinary. And this is where my family's involvement began. Peter Sandberg was my great uncle. He was running the family business. He had 2 brothers. He was an engineer, an enthusiast, and an inventor. And he was on a mission. His mission was to see how they could recover the cargo from the Egypt. This was in an era where nobody believed it was possible. They were talking about a ship that they estimated was at 400 foot deep. The deepest salvage at the time was 250 foot. In a way that we would now consider strange, Peter Sandberg was having dinner with the chairman of Lloyd's, a man called Sir Percy McKinnon, and the underwriters. And over the dinner, they agreed that Sandberg could attempt the salvage operation. And if successful, we could keep half the cargo. Peter was determined, and that was the beginning of his mission. He had design ideas for how to reach that depth. It was a depth where you would have to be in a pressurized suit. You couldn't, if you didn't combat the pressure by a steel suit, you weren't going to make it. In 1923, knowing that he would need a salvage company behind him who would be able to work with his inventions, he signed an agreement with the Salvage Association, which was then representing the underwriters. Now, I've shown this slide because I want you to understand that the hostility wasn't just the depth. The Bay of Biscay is a scary place when it turns nasty. And those famous pictures we see of lighthouses, well, this is it. That's what they were dealing with. In 1925, I'm just admitting Julia, who's wanting to join. Hello, Julia. In 1925, Peter appointed the Gothenburg Towage Company. Gothenburg, because our Swedish origins. And their mission was to find the wreck and hopefully start the salvage. The poor company had a miserable time. They spent 2 years looking for the wreck and sadly failed. In 1928, another salvage company was appointed called Sarima. And Sarima really became the heroes of this story. They had a salvage ship called the Artiglio. This is the Artiglio, not a very grand ship. Artiglio, for those Italians amongst us, roughly translates as the claw. And we'll come to that more because so much of the salvage was to do with using grabs. The Artiglio also had on board a man called David Scott, who was a journalist from the Times. The Times had decided they wanted to tell the story, so he was there for 3 years recording what was going on, and much of what I'm talking about has come from his books. Now, any salvage is an incredibly dangerous activity, be it from the explosives, equipment failing, diving bells getting snagged. So the potential for loss of life was always high, and those involved must have been incredibly brave and skilled. To highlight this, the previous Artiglio, 2 years earlier on a salvage operation, had exploded, and all the crew were killed. And these were mates of the people on this ship. In an Italian way, they bought this new boat called the Artiglio, and for reasons that I don't fully understand, they refused to call it Artiglio II, as that was considered unlucky. So we're now on to how to find the ship. The only location information they had was the wireless operator's distress call. They were searching an area of 100 square miles. The way they did this, let me just jump forward a bit. Here we have a picture of the witch party on the Artiglio. The way they found the wreck was by 2 ships would steam on a parallel line, towing a weighted cable between them. And whenever the weighted cable found something, they would send a diver down and have a look to see what it was. An incredibly time-consuming and frustrating job. The seabed in this location was flat and sandy, and you can imagine how long this would take. Down would go a diver, and they'd find a supermarket trolley. So frustrating. They identified the search area by 4 main buoys marking each of the outer corners. They then put smaller buoys to identify effectively lanes that they would steam down. And so they would steam parallel lines, try and catch it. And at the end of the first season, they failed. Very depressed, came back second season, and right until the end, they were still having no luck. Everyone was getting frustrated, costing an awful lot of money. What on earth did they do? And at the end of each season, they would remove the outer buoys, because bear in mind, this was the main shipping lane from Northern Europe to the Med, to the Southern Hemisphere. So they came to remove the corner buoys at the end of the second season, and they found that one of the buoys had drifted. So it was out of place. They got hold of it, they pulled it, it was stuck. Eventually, it came up, and at the end of it was a derrick. So very excited, they went down to look at the drawings of the Egypt and found that, irritatingly, the derrick didn't match the lifeboat derricks of the Egypt. So they'd found something, but they were convinced it wasn't the Egypt. Then one young guy on board had another look at the drawing, and there was one derrick, as in small boat crane, that was different, and this was the captain's launch derrick. That's what they had found. So hugely exciting. They had found the Egypt. Here is a headline from December 1930. So this is 8 years after it sank. Sunken liner found. I'm just going to go back one slide because I talked about diving bells that they used to see what they'd found. Here's a picture of the diving bell. Nowadays, we'd think it's a fairly basic piece of kit. In those days, this was revolutionary. It was a way of the diver withstanding the pressure whilst at a depth. And the diving bell had a telephone system on it, which for 1920s, quite extraordinary. So above his head, there was a speaker. He had a mouthpiece, which was also his way of breathing. And from there, he could talk to the ship, and it normally worked. Earlier models of this also had oxygen lines or air lines, but that added extra vulnerability to it, because if that line broke, he's in a muddle. So instead of that, they used filters to filter out the carbon dioxide and create more oxygen. Are you with me so far? Right. Jumping forward to other salvage techniques. This is an extraordinary contraption that Peter Sandberg was involved in designing. They wanted to try and use articulated suits. And here you have one of those suits. In fact, the divers hated them because they leaked. And at 400 foot, when it starts leaking, it's probably quite a scary event. So we tried these, but the most popular one was the diving bell you can see here, which was a steel cylinder. Top came off. It had portholes. Those portholes also leaked occasionally, and this was the one with the telephone. Quite robust, but it needed to be. Diver climbed in through the top. The tube was weighted. They'd adjust the weights to see what it needed to sink. You would have one cable, which the risk of snagging was scary and possibly fatal if it did go wrong. And here he is coming up from having been on the Egypt, describing what he'd found. Right, the ship was sitting on the sandy seabed. Here's a picture that David Scott had sketched. Now, it's quite hard to see. If you can see my mouse, there is the diving bell, which was called the ship's eye. And here is a cradle or grab or claw. And what you've seen here is, this isn't a joke, this is what they did. They had to cut through 4 decks to get down to the bullion room, which was situated at the bottom of the ship across the full width. So the bullion room was a fairly narrow room going from port to starboard. And this picture shows they are at the roof of the bullion room. So the man in the diving bell would be directing the grab left or right, up or down, a bit like Golden Shot. He's doing that in a strong tide. The Artiglio is going up and down with the waves. He's probably bouncing on the bottom of the ship, and he has to place explosives on the deck plates. And these explosives were they were in steel tubes about 6 foot long, linked to an electrical charge. So he would have to position the explosives on the plate. The water was actually helpful in this regard because it would keep the blast directing in the right way. To explode it, he would have to go back to the top. Then they would literally put the plug in, and if they were lucky, boom. And the boom was big enough to shake the Artiglio. And then they would go back down, hopefully to find that the plate had been cut, and most of these plates were riveted, so that you would hope to find the rivets had popped all the way along. Then they had to use the grab to try and grab the plate that was hopefully damaged and pick it up. Now, so he is trying to position this. The Artiglio has to be held still to do this. And to position the Artiglio, I'm just going to, if I can, race up to the early picture. Here we go. It's very hard to see in this picture, but on the bows, there are 3 lines coming off. These are mooring lines that it had to keep it still. At each season, it would drop off 7 concrete mooring weights, concrete tested by Sandberg, of course, into positions around the boat, and then with the lines to the moorings on the winches, the diver would telephone left a bit, right a bit, and the winchman, steam winches, would pull in perhaps 2 yards, and they would move the grab, the diver, everything on top of where he was trying to place the charges. Placing the charges was called threading the needle because it was such an incredibly difficult task. This picture we're jumping now to 2006, and the Egypt is now quite a famous but still challenging dive wreck. Here you've got lights. These guys had no lights. So if it was a cloudy day, it was virtually impossible. Visibility, they estimated, was between 2 and 5 yards. Just extraordinary what they were doing. Let me jump onto this. So here you've got a picture of, after an explosion, the grab pulling out some of the bulkheads from the Egypt. I found out from the reading I've been doing, and it makes sense. Trying to do this on a passenger ship is so much more difficult than a cargo ship because you have so many more bulkheads. And this is a classic example of it. You can see the rivet holes. And as they cut and cut and cut, they effectively created a crater in the ship. The next slide shows a different kind of grab. Here they've got the captain's safe. Very extraordinary how they could position that in a way and capture it, bring it up. Now, the next picture is, by now, this is another David Scott sketch, but there's quite a lot of detail in it. In the middle, you can see the long dark room there is the bullion room. So by now they've pulled the top off, and you can see the damaged walls. And next is what I've called the ship's eye, the diving bell. By now they had a new technique because they were having so much trouble with the diving bell behaving differently to the grab in the tide. They were different weights. So they had attached this big weight they called it the pair. So they'd drop the pair, and then the diving bell could slide up and down on a line connected to the pair to try and keep it roughly where they needed it. The next thing in this picture, which is quite hard to see, the grab's at the bottom. Above the grab is another grab. And the design that we came up with was the cargo that we were picking up was so valuable that they wanted 2 forms of catching it. So the bottom grab would be pulled into the top grab would be shut. Let me go to the next slide. Here's a picture of the double grabs on the deck of the Artiglio. At the bottom, you've got the grab with They Hope Gold, and at the top, you've got the outer grab. Moving to the next picture. This is the outer grab you can see closed with the inner grab inside, and there is a gold ingot. You can imagine how exciting that day was. Here's a picture of the salvage crew, a happy bunch by now. The main man here is called Quaglio, who was the owner of the salvage company. He had sunk not only the business's fortune, but his own money into this operation. And until the gold came up, it was looking absolutely desperate. So suddenly you've moved from a very upset gang to an extremely happy gang. Whether they've got gold under their hats and things, who knows? Moving on, more gold bars. These are the drivers with our hero Quaglio in the middle here, with their gold. In the background, there are lots of banknotes which were out to dry. They also came up from Egypt. Incredibly brave guys, these divers, to do this. And I'm very pleased to say throughout this salvage, there were no serious casualties. Here's another lovely picture of the boss with his gold bars. It wasn't just gold that was in the ship. It also had a whole lot of sovereigns. How do you pick up sovereigns? Challenging. So Peter Sandberg designed a hoover. What this involved was a steel cylinder, hollow, with a glass bottom. Cylinder was about 2 meters long. It would be lowered over where they thought the sovereigns were. And then with the mechanism, the glass bottom was smashed. Because the cylinder was hollow, everything rushed inside, and then another mechanism slammed shut, and they pulled the tube up, hopefully full of sovereigns rather than octopi. Next, I'm moving on to, no, we don't want that one yet. There was a rather fun stage at this because this had attracted the attention of the public. There was a great will for this salvage operation to succeed, and when they'd found the gold, there was a letter written by Sir Percy Mackinnon, chairman of Lloyd's, and he sent this telegram to Mussolini. So we're now talking in 1932. The chairman of Lloyd's sends congratulations to all Italians upon the magnificent success which has been achieved by their fellow countrymen in salving the gold from the Egypt. Their success is a practical illustration of the advantages of international cooperation. And if all nations would join together in the same spirit to salve the world from the deep waters in which it is now submerged, success would be speedily attained. He was, of course, referring to Europe. Now, that caught quite a few people's attention. And this sort of happy idea of Sir Percy Mackinnon's, it was taken up by Punch, who gave Quaglia, the boss, the signal of honour of appearing in its pages. Bernard Partridge drew a cartoon in which Ramsay MacDonald appealed to a diver in full equipment with the word Artiglio printed on his chest to come and make another great recovery. The Lausanne conference was then sitting. The British Prime Minister in the Punch cartoon pointed the way along the road to Lausanne. You've done wonders with the Egypt, he said to the diver. Now come along to the Lake of Geneva and see if you can get something up from the wreck of the Europa. And 7 years later, we were at war. Moving on from the Mussolini letter, the Artiglio then took its first cargo of gold to Plymouth, which is where it was to be offloaded. And quoting back from the book, this is rather a nice bit, which I hadn't seen until a few days ago. So this is from the ship. We ride at our anchor, waiting for our orders. Plymouth lies still and sunny, wrapped in the peace of an English Sunday. Suddenly, English voices and thin feminine cheers break the sleepy silence. 2 motorboats came containing men in soft hats and women in summer frocks round our stern and sweep alongside. There are Peter Sandberg and Mrs. Sandberg and their 2 sons, and Count Buragi, who was Quaglia's London agent, and pretty English girls. One of them holds in her arms a lantern-jawed British fox terrier with a red, white and green bow tied on his collar. That's the dog Beck, promised to the Artiglio as her mascot. So many fun, weird details that come out from this. Now, my last cutting from the Times, it's all going very well until, oh no, the French. The French have decided this cargo should belong to them. So they appealed to the British to say the cargo should be arrested. And sure enough, this cutting from 27th of June 1932, cargo put under arrest as it arrives at Plymouth. Luckily enough, that only lasted a day. So it was released the following day and sent to London. We're nearly there. I'm just going to show you, if I can do this, a video that I found last week of the Artiglio arriving in Plymouth and being unloaded. Hopefully you can see that. Thumbs up if that's working. Those boxes are what they put the gold ingots in. Very fine specimen of manhood. Another picture I found is this picture showing the offloading at Plymouth. Rather nicely, it turns out that that is my grandfather and that's my great uncle. And they're obviously in a happy place because these are silver ingots. They're silver because they're not, silver does, well, you all know, it'll tarnish. But it's a lovely picture. It's actually rather a good quality picture of what's going on. So here I have in front of me, if we can see it, a banknote, which is 1,000 kronen. It was underwater for 8 years. It was salvaged from the Egypt. It's from the Austro-Hungarian Bank. And we were very excited about these. We've got loads of them. We investigated whether they're valuable, and we were told, yes, you're very, very lucky. They're very valuable unless they have a red stamp on. And all of them have this red stamp. Now, Sandberg have chemistry labs. You'd have thought with our chemistry lab we could find a way. Not yet. I need a better chemistry lab, I think. A couple of other side stories. My father and his sister, when they got the gold, were aged 10 and 8. My grandfather had rather rashly promised them before they got the gold, if ever they found the gold, my father and his sister could have whatever they wanted. So then there's a scene that my dad remembers with his father coming up to him and said, I did promise if we found the gold, you could have whatever you wanted. And Dad and his sister got together in a huddle and they came back and they said what they'd really like would be taken to Gilbert and Sullivan at the Savoy Theatre. What an underwhelming response. So the last of the recovered treasure was extracted in 1935, still unaccounted for are 14,929 sovereigns, 17 gold bars, and 30 silver ingots. That's the end of my story. John, I'm going to hand you, John, I'm going to hand you back control if I can. Actually, maybe I don't even need to.
good, Neil.
So,
So Neil, you said at the beginning that various sections of your story were, how can I put it, not entirely the whole truth.
yes.
And are you going to offer us any clues on this, or are you expecting us to risk our hands and guess what that might be?
I'm expecting you all to guess. I'm trying to see how I unmute. I think you can all unmute yourselves if you wish.
Can I ask you? You said there were only 44 passengers on board, and that an awful lot of people were saved, but there was still a death toll of 96. That must have been a hell of a crew for 44 passengers.
Yes. Well. So Terry, I had the same query at the time. It was a big ship. Now, the reason it only had 44 passengers was most of the people who were joining it got on at Marseille.
Ah. Okay.
So this, which was frankly incredibly lucky. So I think it was probably still pretty empty.
So most of the 96 that died were crew then as well. I guess the passengers got sort of looked after first, or was it save yourself and forget about the paying customer?
I don't know. There were stories of heroics about it, but just what a scary moment it must have been.
Got more people off, yeah. Okay.
It was flat calm, which is often the case in fog, which is probably why so many did actually survive.
Neil, I think it was Neil. I think it was Noel Coward who said that if he had to go to sea at all, he'd prefer to sail on a liner registered in Italy, because if anything went wrong, there was nothing of this women and children go first nonsense.
So Miles,
that
you
could
were
explain.
I was interested in doing your research, whether you'd learned anything about the business. It's sort of all rather intriguing, isn't it, that the business gets involved in a salvage? And was there any, I mean, apart from a really good lunch, was there anything, that in the background to the business that you discovered that would suggest that it was, that it could get alongside such an opportunity? And then sort of my supplementary was really what impact it had on the business, and whether kind of patents around diving bells and the experience of doing the salvage kind of influence what the business did next. Did it have an impact, or?
No, it's a very good question. So we at the time we were very entrepreneurial. So we did have an awful lot of patents. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. They're mainly to do with railways, and the business was, I'm pleased to say, very successful. So ventures like this we could afford to do. The venture didn't actually make any money for the business at all. It probably cost about what we got back, but it was much more. What an extraordinary thing to be leading, although the real bravery wasn't Peter. I mean, it was his idea, it was his instigation, but he surrounded himself with the best people in the world at that, and he helped with the designs, and the rest is history. It's a bit of history that I think history in business is always funny. I'm massively proud of the Sandberg history, but that doesn't bring in the next job. We've got to be good now to do that.
Yeah, it had a reputational legacy, though, presumably.
Yes, there's another bit that's very relevant to this, Miles. World War II.
Yeah.
So many businesses were devastated by that, and ours was.
Yes.
Neil, I didn't quite really understand how the diving bell could work by filtering out carbon dioxide and leaving oxygen enough for the diver to survive for very long.
So first of all, there was a serious time limit. They couldn't stay down for too long because of the oxygen problem, but they found using chemicals better than having an oxygen line to the surface, because that just added more risk of snagging. On their mouthpiece, they had a flap. So when they breathed out, the flap was pushed one way, and that went down one side of the pipe to be filtered for the carbon dioxide. And I don't know what chemicals they were using, but they were using that something that created more oxygen to keep the balance about right. But this was, you know, we're talking 100 years ago. How they were doing it and not dying is quite extraordinary.
Neil, I was wondering whether that was one of your fibs, but that was clearly not one of your fibs. But I wonder whether the, I wonder whether the underwater Dyson-sounding Hoover for sovereigns was one of your fibs, because you didn't show us any photos of the sovereigns or of the Hoover.
Thumbs up if you think the Hoover was a fib.
No, I thought it was true.
I don't.
No,
It wasn't.
good
It
to
was
me.
true.
No.
The Hoover
Well
was. I nearly. We were going to play a little game with the name of it, but no, that was true.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah, we were going to call it the Edgar Hoover, and it was and the Hoover Dam was named after it. So that was true. There was one fib which I got away with, I think, which was pretending that the concrete mooring blocks had been tested by Sandberg.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think we picked that up actually.
You got that one. And and the supermarket trolley. I thought, what can I come up with? My supermarket trolley.
That was too obvious.
Supermarket trolley, absolutely.
Yes.
I don't suppose they have one.
You got to play to the audience a bit, you know.
I presume, Neil, you were deliberate about the fact that it was a sort of hospital ship in World War II. It was actually World War I, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, silly me. Did I mention World War II? Yeah. Okay, there. That was one of the fibs.
I thought it was a tip of the tongue. The stuff that's still missing, Neil, obviously people have crawled all over this in the decades since, so there's definitely nothing left down there. There were no holes in the bullion room so that it could have floated off before you went and got it all rescued. So you're alluding to the fact that either it was under some of those guys' hats or has mysteriously sort of been filched since. Yeah, there's definitely no more to find on the site.
Well, 5 years ago, there was another headline in the paper about professional divers picking up more gold from the Egypt. And once again, the gold was impounded by the French. There's a nice article in the book because so much of the book I've read was actually about the people on the ship and how they all got on. And in a way, that was the story, their bravery. And there's a nice phase where you think, hang on, all that gold, how on earth do you stop it disappearing down people's trousers and things? And David Scott said, whilst that they did have a man from Lloyd's on the ship to count everything, and he quotes, "This was completely unnecessary. They were such a team, that gold could have been left out at night and no one would have touched it."
Can we just ask how the contractual arrangement worked? Because I think you started off by saying that your grandfather or great uncle did a deal with Lloyd's that they would get 50% if they could salvage it. They obviously then employed the Italians to come along, but what was Sandberg's cut at the end? I mean, how did it work?
So we got approximately 50% of what we salvaged. And bearing in mind, we had funded the salvage contracts involved a part base fee, and rather nicely, I actually have the contracts, which is extraordinary. So the salvage contracts were part on a base fee and part on success. So them finding the gold was extraordinary. The Italian divers, their average wage was £65 a year, which wasn't much. So for them to get the gold was a very big moment. I just show you if I can find it. So here I have. It might not show very well. This is because I've got this silly background screen. You probably can't see it. How's that going to work? Yeah, here is one of the salvage contracts.
Okay.
rather frustratingly, here's another one. Rather frustratingly, the poor Göteborg towage organization put 2 years into it and failed. So they left with their tails between the legs, only for the others to succeed.
Have you got any of the coins?
No, I haven't, which is really irritating.
Yeah.
But they're actually, if you went, they're auctioned every now and then. So if you Googled gold sovereigns from Egypt, you will find, I think they're genuine ones that were underwater for 8 years.
Neil, who was it that the gold belonged to in the first instance?
I'm not sure. No, well, so different bits of gold had different names on. So I think some were going to banks in India, some were going to businesses. But after Lloyd's paid out, it then became the property of the underwriters.
Indeed.
And so that was our arrangement was with them.
Neil, do you think such a exciting but slightly rash decision could be made through the governance of the Sandberg's governance systems in Grosvenor Gardens today?
The question sounds far too complicated for me at this stage. Stop
No,
bullying.
you said we used to be entrepreneurial, and it got me thinking.
I think this was an extraordinary days of daring do.
Yeah.
And rather nicely, it's been dramatized into a film with Daniel Craig as the lead role. Or not. Maybe that's a
Is that coming next year?
So I talked about the Gothenburg company. So after their failure for 2 years, they were paid £500, and here's their contract about that. In spite of the search not being successful, and rather nicely, the letterhead there is 40 Grosvenor Gardens. That's where I was working today. And that was in 1925.
The same office they've been in since 1925.
Brilliant.
Yes. You've all been a very tolerant audience. Did the IT work all right?
Yes.
Brilliantly.
Very good.
Oh,
Thank
very
you.
good.
Very much, yes.
I'm sorry,
Well,
I probably went on a bit, but I'm so interested.
Neil,
in that.
I think we owe you a big vote of thanks, not only for putting in such a big effort, but also making us laugh on a otherwise grey and miserable evening. I think the looking back on it, that deal that was done over dinner, probably at Boodle's or White's or somewhere like that, is incredible, really. It was operating on a sort of concept almost unknown these days, which runs roughly along the lines of my word is my bond. And then I suppose the lawyers had an absolute heart attack when they had to put the deal into some sort of contractual arrangement, which from the bits of paper you were holding up looked as if it was almost done on the back of an envelope compared to what you'd have these days. But actually it's a fascinating story, and a very uplifting one, as I said earlier, and heartwarming. that it all ended well, and that everybody got their due reward. Well, apart from some of the early protagonists who I think came out of it rather badly, but through nobody's fault. It's been really, really interesting to hear about it. So I think we should all give you the traditional thank you by way of a sort of virtual round of applause, if we can all hear it.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you, Master.